Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Joe Ellis, Olympus educator and wedding and portrait photographer here in Dallas, Texas. And today I want to talk about how I set up my EM1 Mark III for weddings, events, documentary, and portrait work. I'm going to go through line by line of the menu as I have it set and all the customizations that I've made to make my life easier with the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark III. Let's get into it. Okay, so I've broken up this set of tips here into 4 different sections. I have focus settings, I have exposure and white balance settings, I have sort of some general settings, and then I have video specific settings. So let's go through each of these sections one by one. I'll kind of pull up the menus here on the back of the camera and you guys can walk through this with me. Hopefully you guys will find a tip or two that's really helpful in your work. Okay, so first thing is back button focus. This has been a bone of contention with people for a really long time, but I would tell you I do not use back button focus because I like to focus and recompose. I just really like to separate the act of focusing and the act of firing the camera from each other, which means that the camera only focuses when I press the AEL AFL button and the camera only fires when I hit the trigger. I find this really useful in my brain just for ease of use and knowing that whenever I let off at the switch, the camera's not trying to autofocus, and no matter what I do with the trigger button, it only has one job. This certainly varies from photographer to photographer, so if you love doing it a different way, this certainly isn't critical. But for me, if you want to turn on back button focus, the first thing you got to do is go to gear A1. So I'll go to the menu here, we'll go go down to gears, and then A1. And then in this menu here, we have SAF and CAF. That's single autofocus and continuous autofocus. You need to make sure that SAF is on mode 3 and CAF is on mode 4. That will map the autofocus to the AEL AFL button. And the last step in this process is you need to go down to the halfway AF setting here and make sure that's set to inoperative. Otherwise, both the trigger and the AEL AFL button will both be trying to do autofocus and competing with one another. Okay, the second part of autofocus is in face detect. And this was a big change, and I actually made a video about this a few days ago, but I really love the face detect in the EM1 Mark III. I think it's an order of magnitude better than the autofocus, than the face autofocus in any other Olympus camera body. And the way that I have set the camera up to make this easy for me is that there are 2 buttons that are custom buttons that fall under your right hand when you're gripping the camera. The top button in my configuration is for changing faces, and the bottom button is for turning on and off face detect. So if face detect isn't working for whatever reason, because people's heads are turning, some sort of lighting condition, or if I'm shooting like inanimate objects like dresses or invitations or food or whatever, and I want to turn off face detect, I can do that with the step of a button. And then if I'm working a group of people and the camera chooses a different face from the one that I want, I can hit the other button and rotate a wheel on the camera and it'll switch between faces for me. So the way to set that up is that you want to go ahead and make sure face detect is active. So for me, if I bring up my super control panel, I just make sure that my face detect is on for both my SAF and CAF settings. Now, it's important to note when you look at the face detect that there are several different options here. There's regular face detect, there's an off setting, of course, there's face plus a little eye next to the icon, and then there's IL and IR. That stands for left eye and right eye and basic eye detect. For weddings, events, and documentary work, I find that regular face detect with eye priority is my favorite setting. This means that it will choose the eye closest to the camera, and it will choose the eye if it's capable of picking it out of the scene. Depending on the head size of the person, how close they are to the camera will determine whether eye autofocus is engaged or if it's simply focusing on the face. This has been super accurate for me, super easy to use, so I use the face plus eye all the time. Now, to map those 2 buttons, you would go to the menu, and then you go down to gear B for button, and then button function, and then you would just scroll through all the custom buttons on the camera until you get to 2 on the front. And you can see that the top button I have for face select, and the bottom button I have for face priority. So now the camera is set up so those 2 buttons are handling that, and that's their one and only job. Okay, so orientation linked AF point. So the camera has the capability of changing the way it's autofocusing based on its orientation. So it can be in one set of settings when you're holding the camera horizontally, and you flip the camera vertically, and the autofocus mode and the autofocus point change. But what I really do love is that I'll often have an autofocus point chosen for a horizontal image, let's say high center, and then I'll have an autofocus point chosen for a vertical image, which may be over here in horizontal mode, but as soon as I turn the camera, it becomes my top center. Now, when I turn the camera, the autofocus point will flip between the two based on the orientation. I find that really expedites kind of getting to the right autofocus point. So to use that, you would just go back into the menus, and you would go to A2. So it's gear mode, it's gear menu A2, and then down to orientation linked. And so I use target only. So here you can choose target mode or target point. And I like target point to be checked. That's going to move between the two autofocus points, but I don't want the mode to change. Okay, the next one is the MF clutch. In a lot of Olympus's Pro lenses, there's a clutch mechanism on the lens itself. It's the focus ring that you can pull back and push forward to go between autofocus and manual focus. I don't use this because I am typically working with two camera bodies, and I will be picking them up in a hurry, and sometimes when they're sitting on my hip, that will get accidentally tripped, which means when I pull the camera to my face, I don't know it's in manual focus, and that slows me down. So I just simply make all of my MF clutch mechanisms and all of my lenses inoperative. So to do that, you would just go to gear A4 and go to MF clutch and set it to inoperative. If it's something that really works well for your style of photography, or if you really like going between manual focus and autofocus, then you can certainly leave it engaged. Okay, color of the inactive AF point. So when you first pick up an Olympus camera, when you look through it, the autofocus point, when it's not actively being moved, changed, or whatever, or used, is set to kind of a gray color. And this can be oftentimes very hard to see when you're looking through the camera. So you can actually change the color of your inactive AF point. And you would do that in gear D3. And it's under grid settings, and then display color, preset 1, and then just keep arrowing over until you get to the RGB. Now I have mine set to white, and so I've set my RG and B values to 255. That'll make white. You can actually turn this to any color that works for you. So you can, set it to pink or red or green or yellow or whatever contrasting color works for your style of photography or the situation that you're in. I've tried a couple of them. I think red worked really well. I'm trying white right now. I just like to know where my autofocus point is all the time, even if I don't have pressure on the switch or the camera's not actively autofocusing. So I have it be a little bit higher contrast color, and that works well for me. Okay, the AF Illuminator. So the AF Illuminator is a little flashlight that's built into the camera, a little amber light that turns on when the camera finds that there's not enough light to autofocus. It'll turn on that lamp, help it autofocus, and then turn back off. If you're using an EM1 Mark III or an EM1X, I have yet to run into a scenario where that autofocus illuminator really helped a lot. The cameras are so capable of focusing in dark situations that it just never comes up, and I don't like having that flashlight blinking on and off in people's faces. So if I want to turn off the AF illuminator, it's in gear A3. So we'll just go up to A3, and I have my AF illuminator set to off. Okay, next up, exposure and white balance. So this was a big change in the EM1 Mark III, and a very welcome addition is that now when you turn on Live View Boost, you can do it via a custom button, and you can see an indicator on the LCD screen and in the viewfinder that Live View Boost is engaged. This is important because Live View Boost decouples the exposure from the camera and from viewing the camera and what you have it set to. So for example, if I'm in a dark room and I am underexposing the background by 2 stops, so it's 2 stops too dark, and I'm counting on the flash that I have on my camera to make up that light, I don't want to have to stare at a dark picture because I have it underexposed. I'm shooting in a dark condition. I know that. I have my flash set, so I know that it's going to add the light during exposure. So instead of getting an accurate preview of my exposure, I want to decouple the two of them so I can look at a bright image for composition and timing and not have to stare at a dark one. That's why I use Live View Boost. I have it mapped to the plus-minus button on top of my camera, to the exposure compensation button. So if I tap that button, the viewfinder and the LCD screen will become artificially bright, allow me to see in dark conditions when I have a flash on my camera. And to boot, now there is a indicator on the screen that says live view boost. I think maybe it says boost. Let's see. It says boost right above the meter on the back of the camera. It's a green boost signal. And that just allows me to know that I have that engaged. Because one mistake you can make is if you move between a dark situation and a bright situation, and you have the exposure decoupled from the viewfinder, then you could make a wrong exposure in the conditions and not know it because you're looking at an artificially brightened image. So I love Live View Boost. I use it all the time. I have it mapped to that button. And I love now that there's an indication that that mode is turned on when you're looking through the viewfinder. So I would just simply go to Gear Menu B, 1, Button Function, and then you can see that I have the plus minus or the exposure compensation button set for Live View Boost. Okay, flash white balance default. So whenever a flash is turned on the camera will default to flash white balance. It can always be overridden. It's not important if you're shooting RAW because you can always go back and change it later, but I like to have that done because if I'm shooting in a dark condition and I'm shooting, let's say, incandescent light artificially, and I shoot a few photos and then I want to turn on my flash, get a couple more photos of the same condition, as soon as I turn the flash on, it will default to flash white balance, and that means that the accurate color will come through in all of those situations. So I like it. I've turned it on, and we can find it in Gear Menu G. So I'll just go down to G. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not G, it's F. It's in F, sorry guys, and it's in flash plus white balance, and you just want to make sure that that's set so that whenever a flash is turned on, the camera will default to the flash white balance. Okay, live control. Okay, so I think most of us are familiar with the super control panel on the back of Olympus cameras. It's sort of a one-shot look on the back of the screen if you hit the OK button that shows all the various settings of the camera. But there is also an alternate way of looking at settings, and that is through the live control, and that's where all the settings kind of show up on the side of the frame and across the bottom of the frame. I prefer only to have one of those active. I like the super control panel more, so I've disabled my live control panel. And we can get to that in Gear D1. So we'll go up to D1, Control Settings, and I've turned off live control. So now whenever I hit the OK button, there's no cycling between different modes here. I only have my super control panel. Okay, so another thing I love to do is kind of turn on my level, shadows and highlights, and my histogram when I'm looking through my camera. I like that for it to be a page of information on the back of the camera. So if we go to Gear D1 and we go to Info Settings and we go to Live View Info, we can look at our image only display, and then Custom 1 and Custom 2 are pages of information that show us those three things. So we can turn on the histogram, the highlight and shadow, and the level gauge. And this will allow us to view these things by hitting the info button. You can cycle through pages of information. One of those pages is going to be Custom 1, where you can see all of those things at the same time. So super useful. All right. Another thing I've kind of turned off on my cameras is that Olympus cameras for a while now have had this sort of setting by default where they bias the auto white balance only, to warmer colors. Not all white balances, not manual white balances, not preset white balances, but auto white balance can be biased towards warm colors. I prefer to go ahead and turn that off, and that's in Gear Menu G. And you can turn auto white balance, keep warm color off. And that way, when the camera is in auto white balance, and let's say you're under some warm incandescent bulbs, it's not trying to make that auto white balance a little bit warmer. It's trying to keep things very neutral. I just prefer the neutral. I'm shooting in RAW anyway. I'm controlling my white balance pretty critically and oftentimes manually, so I'd prefer not to have that as a default when I do use auto white balance. Okay, so general camera settings. All right, we're getting through this. Beep. Okay, so this is when the camera chirps at you every time it achieves autofocus. And not something that I want my camera to do. Your mileage may vary, but if you want to turn your beep off, that's in D4. And I have mine set to off, so the camera is as silent as possible. I don't get a confirmation beep when it's in focus, but what you do see through the viewfinder and on the LCD screen is a green dot appear right about here over in the corner that does tell you, yes, we've achieved positive focus confirmation. Image review off. So if I go down to the wrench and record view, this is where you turn off the camera bringing up the last photo that you took as soon as you let go of the trigger. So by default, if you take a photo and let off the trigger, the last photo you took will pop up on the back of the screen. I don't like this. I only want that to happen when I press the play button. So I turn my record view off. Okay. EVF auto switch. Okay, this was a big change that happened with the EM1 Mark III and the EM1X, and that is that they put a setting in whenever you have the LCD screen flipped out, then the EVF auto switch is not engaged. I find this super helpful because if I have the camera at my chest or waist level and I have the screen flipped out and I'm looking down at it, I don't want my chest to activate the EVF auto switch. So to turn that on, you would go to gear menu I, scrolling. Okay, EVF auto switch set to on 2, and that will enable the eye sensor when the monitor is closed. Okay, so that means that closed position is into the camera body. Okay, dual independent down. So when I'm working an event, I always have 2 cards in my camera, and the way I set it up is I have JPEGs going to card 2 and RAW files going to card 1. And what I don't want is if my RAW card was to become full, I don't want the camera to keep writing JPEGs to the other card. So I have my card situation set up for dual independent down. And that means if my RAW card were to become full, the camera will alert me, I can change it out, but it won't keep shooting if that card were to become full. So if I just go to my super control panel and then I go to my card settings, you can see here that I have this set for dual independent down. And that just is a nice safety feature that makes sure that the camera's not going to keep firing if one of my 2 cards becomes full at any time. Okay, review magnification. So I love this feature. This came as a firmware update to the EM1 Mark II a while back, but this is where if you're reviewing a photograph and you magnify it, it immediately jumps to 100% magnification, allowing you to get very accurate check on focus and whatnot. So you would just go to gear D2. So D2, and you would go to the playback default magnification setting and make sure that's set to equally value. That's Olympus speak for 100%. All right, so dial function. One of the ways that I've been using cameras forever is, and I love that Olympus cameras give you this as an option, but if you go into gear B1 and go to dial function, and then especially for manual, I like having my shutter and aperture set this way, where I have the shutter on the front dial and my aperture on the back dial. It's just something that's become ingrained in my mind over the years of using cameras, and every time I pick up a new one, I have to set this in the camera for my style of shooting. If there's anything like that that's been bugging you, you can go in here and make those changes so it's more intuitive to your mind. But for me, this is what works best. Okay, copyright. So one of the things you can do with Olympus cameras, you can go ahead and set your copyright name and information directly into your file. So as soon as they're written to the card, your information is already there. So if you just go to gear H1 and then down to copyright settings, you can set copyright info, and then you can put your name. I haven't added mine in here yet, but you can go in and just takes a minute, but you can type your name out and then it will appear as part of the metadata for every single one of your images. Super helpful. Okay, so that is, let's see, 18 customizations I've made to the camera. But I also want to talk about video for a second. And there's a couple of big things I want to talk about here. The first one is a huge fix for those of us that move between doing stills and video at the same time. And that is with the EM1 Mark II, for example, if you go between shooting pictures, still pictures, and then you flip over to your video mode, your exposure settings from your stills carry over. So if you're at a 250th of a second at f3.5 in stills and you go to video, it defaults to those same settings as you move into video mode. This makes you shooting video kind of slower because you have to go in and reset the exposure for the correct, double the frame rate, shutter value, and whatnot if you're shooting video. But now with the EM1 Mark III, actually your video exposure is completely separate from your stills exposure. So I just want to mention that as a huge fix. Also, a big on the wish list for Olympus users is the ability to use auto ISO when you're in manual video mode. So now I can have my shutter and aperture locked off as manual exposure for video and have the auto ISO engaged for video mode. This was a big win and certainly makes it quicker and easier to shoot video on the fly. So we just go to specification settings, and right here is movie mode manual ISO auto set. So you can actually turn on auto ISO for manual exposure in video and set the upper and lower limits for that auto ISO. Super helpful. Face detect really works in video. I love this feature. The only thing that's caused me any grief is when I forget to turn it on. Otherwise, it's been so accurate. But face detect continues to impress. So if you're shooting video and you're shooting video of people, turn on your face detect, and 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a big win for you. Don't forget to turn on the sound and power for mics. So if I go back out and we go to movie sound, really important that this is set to on, and also that your plug-in power is set to on if you have a mic that doesn't have a battery. These are critical things to do before you shoot video for the first time to make sure your camera is going to record sound and it is actually going to use the mic that you have. If you put a mic in here and this is set to off that doesn't have batteries, then you'll get no sound coming through the camera. And then my last piece of advice, I won't go through everything here because maybe we'll do this in another video, is that when you flip the camera into video mode, you have to think of your EM1 Mark III as being a completely separate camera. All of the settings that you made for stills in terms of the way you set the camera up, all the buttons you've set, all the autofocus things you set, you have to do all of those things again for video, and you can change them. So this is really important that you set the custom buttons up, if you're me, to be exactly the same, because I don't want to have to relearn where everything is. So for example, if you go into the button functions for video mode, I want my face detect to be on the front of the camera. So go through your video settings just like it's a completely separate camera from your stills settings. That way everything will be set up correctly. Otherwise, when you go into video mode, you'll find that the defaults for all the buttons on the camera are different from the ones you have set for stills. So if you guys are interested in that, let me know in the comments, or if you have questions about video mode, I will certainly answer those. But that is my customizations for the EM1 Mark III so far. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you guys have done to make your life easier with your EM1 Mark III, and I'll see y'all in the next one.